morning to all our viewers and ma'am to you too. Um, Today we have Miss Parnika Pavanram. She is a treasured alum of the Department of Commerce. She specialized in finance and accounting. She's currently the Assistant Commissioner for the Government of Karnataka and is posted as the General Manager of Admin and Accounts. She joined the Karnataka Administrative Services in 2020 and was posted in Bellary for around a year on COVID duty. Here, she successfully established COVID management systems and also worked with Parivartana, a project for FSWs in Bellary district, and helped disburse compensation amounts to people awaiting payment for over a decade. Ma'am, it's a pleasure to have you here. I had the opportunity to interact with ma'am for a few minutes prior, and she has a very powerful and inspiring story to share with us today. Um, so, to begin with, right off the bat, um, how what prompted you to choose Karnataka Administrative Services? How did you discover that that is a role and a job you want to be in?
Right. So to begin with, I was pursuing my BCom course here at Christ, and I think around the second year we were given an opportunity to be part of the internship at Goldman Sachs, and it was a great role. It was a great job, great manager, a lot of learning, but something just didn't feel enough. So while everything was working out fine on the corporate side, I just felt that that's not something that I see myself doing for the rest of my life, which is when I tried to sit and contemplate on what it is that has given me joy in all the things that I've done so far. And since grade 9, I was volunteering with a lot of NGOs in the field of teaching and, developing content for rural children and all of these things. So that was something that genuinely made me happy. So that kind of led me to the point where I decided that doing anything that's along the lines of service or seva to the people, to the needy people, is something that is going to be sustainable for me. So that at that point, I saw only two options. One is that of being a teacher, or that of being a civil servant. And since the latter had an age limit for the number of attempts and everything, I decided to go ahead with that first, and told myself that I'll give myself 2 years to genuinely try for these exams. If it doesn't go through, I can always go back to my plan of probably pursuing a master's in education and going ahead with the teaching field. So that's how I landed up here.
All right. I feel like as commerce graduates, we all have a very niche understanding of the professions we can pursue post graduation. But a very insightful way of looking at it is what are the skills beyond what you're learning in college? Something that really inspires you, that you're really passionate about. And I feel like once we take that into consideration for the career choices we can make, it really opens up the spectrum. And that's something you were able to identify at an age like I was at, and I think that's something we can all really take away. Um, to the position you are in right now, what drives you? What is your purpose being an officer?
So I think most of us who get into this profession are in it because you get to do some good. At the end of the day, when you're done with a day's work, you get to say that, what I did helped somebody somewhere. So I think that's bottom line the motivation to do something on a day-to-day basis, however difficult or convenient it may be.
Correct. Um, you were telling me about your experiences in Bellary off screen.
So in case of Ballari, of course, anyone who's in this role or knows about this job knows that it comes with its own challenges. You have to interact with a lot of different kind of people. You're not in your comfort zone almost always. So it kind of gets to the point where you have to look beyond your own personal comforts a lot of the time. And I think the motivation for that is you see people right in front of you who are in need of some kind of assistance. And you, as the government, the whole point of being the government is that, unlike a corporate which is probably driven by its profits primarily, government's focus is to not look out for its own good. It's to look out for the welfare of people. So if you simply be there and do that, that's your job done. So I think that's my biggest takeaway from Ballari as well.
I can only imagine how grounding and humbling an experience it is. And while also simultaneously being so rewarding because you're seeing what you're doing for these people. That's absolutely incredible. Um, to go to a more student facing side of this, um, I'm sure we have a lot of young aspirants who want to possibly be where you are today. Um, so, what advice do you have for them, primarily and secondary? What was your KS interview experience like? I'm sure a lot of us have sat on YouTube and looked at those videos of the panel and how intimidating it is. So, tell us a little bit about what that was like for you.
So the KS interview as such, as in it's supposedly it should go along the lines of what is your graduation, as in what is your work experience, what is your optional subject, and what you list out as your hobbies. So the questions should be usually along these four lines. But in my case, it was a very generic interview. It was more of current affairs. They asked me who is the uh, who do you share your birthday with. In my case, it was I shared my birthday with Roger Federer. So that led to a whole tangent along the lines of tennis and name the four major tournaments and how does some of the records that are held by some of the major players, and then we moved to we moved to summer solstice because I think not summer solstice. I think it was an equinox. The day of my interview happened on the day of an equinox, so that went on a geography tangent. So it was kind of all over the place, but I guess that's how it's meant to be, so that they actually get to see how quickly you switch between things and still maintain the composure to give a sensible enough answer. So it was actually a nice experience. I think of all the three levels of the exam, it was the interview that was most enjoyable.
I can only imagine. Those were quite a few tangents. Um, on that line, you told us about how vast their line of questioning was, and I can only imagine what the examinations were like. How did you manage studying for that? Did you completely take a break from working to concentrate on studying, or was that something you did simultaneously with another job? Um, Tell us a little bit about that.
So in my case, I had no clue about the exam or what it takes or anything. So it was because I have no one, I have no friends who have done this. I have no one in the family who has done it. So for me, I just gave myself those 2 years that I mentioned. Those 2 years were a complete break where I did not work anywhere and it was full time preparation. But it turns out that working and preparing was a better option for me, which is why during the second year, towards the end of the second year of preparation, I was also working in an edtech company and while also preparing for these exams. So I think that's the key to being an aspirant. It's see most of the time students who are aspiring to be civil servants usually think about what syllabus I have to study, what book should I read, which coaching class is better, but I think if half the effort that they put into studying is diverted towards understanding what works for them, that goes a much longer way in helping. Because this exam particularly is one where you really need to understand what works for you. Because what works for me need not necessarily work for another person. So I was told that 100% committed studies is what is going to get you through, which is why that's what I did initially. But towards the later part, I realized that as an individual, I like to do, I like to have a change of pace once in a while. So I used to work part time in the edtech company, which was a different zone altogether, and then I would come back and study. So that way, it kind of helped me to balance things out, and it's not monotonous. So I probably don't handle monotony well, which is what I realized by the end of that time. So I think being aware of who you are and what works for you is extremely important in this process. And you, unless you do that, I don't think anybody else's strategy works for you largely.
Correct, of course, I understand that. And I'm sure, like, through any competitive exam we've written as students, we understand a little more about how we study and how we function. Um, I just wanted to ask what led up to you deciding in your second year of preparing that you would like to also have a part time job while studying?
I think the it gets too intense after a point because you're spending what 14 hours, 15 hours a day studying, and it's not sustainable. At least to me, in the long run. There are people who have done 16 hours and still managed to do it well. It works for them, that's their thing, that's great. But for me, it was not something that was working out. So I realized that maybe even 6 hours of committed time of studying is better for me than 14 hours of continuous time. So I kind of worked it out in such a way that it's more about quality of time than quantity of time. So that worked towards the end.
There's also a psychological principle called the Pareto principle, which talks about how 80% of the things you achieve happen in 20% of your time. And I feel like we're all coming to the point of realizing that 100-hour work weeks don't necessarily achieve the maximum productivity. So, can you tell us a little bit about what a day in the life of a civil servant looks like? And I understand that you've had different roles, so feel free to like jump back and forth.
I think the best part of a civil servant's day is that no 2 days are alike. Uh, each day is different. You meet different kinds of people, you encounter different kinds of challenges, and there are days when probably nothing is happening. It's not like something's always happening, need not be. On some days, it's the peak of work. On some days, it's quite relaxed. So you get to see both. But maybe on an average, a day would look like, um, honestly, it's hard to say because you have the whole spectrum of it. But if I have to draw a common factor, it would be that you definitely meet a lot of people from all.
On a daily basis?
Yes, in 90% of the roles as a civil servant, you definitely do get to meet a lot of people from all uh, varieties. I mean, from in all varieties. So, be it at least in my previous role, we used to meet farmers, we used to meet other bureaucrats, we used to meet police services, we used to. So that because the work calls for a lot of interaction and parallel, so we did meet a lot of them through the process.
So, currently in your role as the manager for audit and accounting, what does that, like, what proportion of management are you undertaking?
So, what I was doing for the past, before I took on this role as general manager of admin in the information technology and biotechnology department, which is where I'm at right now. Prior to this, I was working as the special land acquisition officer for the agriculture department. So that is where we interact with farmers on a daily basis because it's their land that the government has purchased to build a public welfare project. So we interact with farmers, we interact with surveyors, we interact with the local gram panchayats on a regular basis. Uh, the current role that I'm in now is more of an interaction with IT companies, with startups, and in the hardware sector. So we work more with these entities to make sure that the policies that the government has, be it the IT policy, the BT policy, or the startup policy, we ensure that that's in line with what the industry actually wants. So it's vastly different because there we are working with farmers on a daily basis. We're on the field, we're actually pulling the chain and doing the survey and things like that. Here, where it's more of an office role with more interactions with other organizations and companies. So,
I feel like a lot of students who are pursuing BCom right now fear that the most monotony, as you said, um, that the idea of going to work and knowing what the next month of your life is going to look like because this is the project you're working on and every day you have to come and do these things is something we fear or rather are apprehensive about. And for people who feel very strongly about that, civil service can be a career they can explore very. Yeah. That being said, um, what are some of your most fondest memories in your job?
uh, I would say in the previous role as the land acquisition officer, what we essentially do is we pay them compensation for the land that they have lost. In this particular case, they had not been compensated for almost a decade, and they were in quite an amount of pain as a result. The issue there were some technical issues and some legal issues within their own family because of which this individual was not able to get the compensation that they thought they was supposed to get. In the interaction that happened, we spent about 20 minutes where this individual explained what it is that they're going through, what amount of pain it has caused, so on and so forth. But there was no realistic solution that I could derive at that moment. So all I could do was listen. So by the end of that conversation, the elderly gentleman only said, "See, from what you have just told, I understand that there isn't much that you can do to help me right now. But you were kind enough to spare a couple of minutes of your day to listen to what I had to say. And that's a lot more than what most people have ever done. And that's enough for me right now." So, to a large extent, what I realized in that moment is that more than crores of compensation that I can release, a lot of the time, just a moment's kindness and just treating another human being and putting yourself in their place and just being there, presence itself with the right intentions will make a lot of difference. So, for having taught me that, I think that moment or that memory is that something that is fondest for me.
Well, that's incredible. Even while hearing it, I could, understand the depth of the interaction there, and it was honestly great to even listen to it. I can only imagine how powerful it was experiencing it. Um, on those lines, how has I understand that you worked in Bellary, which is a small district and quite like isolated. Um, how has being a woman in this role impacted your life? What is the feminine perspective to being a civil servant?
So, probably like a lot of other careers, the percentage of women in the workforce in the government is also quite low comparatively. So, there have been instances when I'm probably the only woman in the room for a meeting. But what I personally believe, and this probably, I mean, not everybody needs to agree with this view, but I feel that instead of focusing on, oh, she's a woman, oh, he's a man, oh, they're not looking at me, they're not listening to me, they're not considering me. I think the minute we shift our focus to the work at hand, so my work there was to give out compensation. And irrespective of what it demanded of me physically, which a lot of people thought may not be possible, my only focus was I need to get this job done. And towards the end of that experience, the people around me also saw that, their perspective also shifted. And they no longer saw that I am a woman or a man or, young or old or any of these distinctions. So when all of our goals are united towards one objective, which is, let's say, at that point, the work at hand, naturally all these distinctions will fall apart and you will not have to worry about what will they say, whether they'll listen to me, whether they'll talk to me and things like that. So I think that's the most important perspective that I have, which has helped me as well in the career, saying yes, they will probably look at me differently because I'm a woman, but I don't need to look at myself differently just because I'm a woman. Here the common ground is that both of us are here to get a job done, and if both of us are aligned to that, or if I can get everybody to get aligned to that, that's it, that's my job. I don't need to assert myself or try to get my voice heard. Those are all unnecessary at that point. Work, that's what.
It's very secondary.
Yeah, it becomes secondary when work becomes most important, or the job at hand, or some needy person who needs to be served at that moment becomes the core of your universe. Everything else, who is man, who is woman, who is old, who is young, who is rich, who is poor, all of those things will naturally fall away. So I think that's something that has helped me to not carry this burden that I'm going to be ill treated, or I have been ill treated, or any of these things, because honestly that's just never been my focus. I'm there to do my job, and as long as that's happening, nothing else matters. So
I think once people recognize competence, everything else becomes secondary, and they can refocus on the fact that this individual can finish the job in a way that has to be performed, and everything else really like fades into the background. Yeah. Um. So from where you are today, what would be your ideal career trajectory? Is there a fixed path? Is there
so yeah, back when I was doing my graduation here, I believed in having, 5-year plans and 10-year plans.
Yeah, I feel like most of us are there right now.
Yeah, but I think at this point right now, I uh, I personally believe that I take a day at a time. I plan that day intensely because inherently I'm a planner, but I have made it a point to not go beyond that because when you're in such a role, uh, or actually all of us are in the same circumstance, some of us are able to see it more closely, some of us are not. You tend to see that, nothing is guaranteed and nothing is permanent. And you cannot really say that, today I'm in this job, 5 years later, I'm going to be in this same job at a higher post and at a much higher post 10 years later. So it's just not a given. And I think COVID has gone a long way in proving to all of us as to how transient everything is. So I personally take that very, very strongly and I take it a day at a time. I honestly have no plans.
All right. I think we can all really take the lesson of do not overplan your life to the point where you are resistant to change.
Yeah, exactly. That's very important.
Because I feel like that's something we as commerce graduates like really live by. I will graduate, I will work for 2 years, I'll get my MBA, I
Yeah.
will move abroad, I'll come back to India. All these things are very like inherent, and I feel like a big part of it is just the Indianness of us, trying to micromanage our own lives.
I think more than the Indianness, it's just that generationally, it's only our previous generation who has had the luxury of looking beyond basic amenities.
Correct.
So they have been very particular that I have to be at a good paying job. I have to have a family set up because you never know what happens. That kind of a thing. So we have sort of inherited that planning, conventional planning, probably to some extent. But I think we as a generation are now headed to a time where we have the luxury of saying that I will take it as it comes. I will plan to have my basics sorted so that I'm not dependent on anyone and I'm not, posing an obstacle to anyone. But I don't have to be, very rigid saying this is the only way that something can work. This is the only thing that's going to work. So I think we as a generation are lucky to have that luxury.
Correct, of course. I feel like a very big part of it is also like from our families, we learn these things, but we should also learn to look beyond the perspective that is given to us and look at the perspective we choose to have
Yeah.
in that sense, of course. Um, just you were talking about COVID. Um, what was COVID like for you personally and as a civil servant? Because I can only imagine how big a whirlwind of
Oh yeah, I think everyone was in that big whirlwind at that point of time. Uh, so I was. This was when just after the first wave of COVID began. I was desperate to do something. There was so much going on. I wanted to be of some help in some way, and thankfully at that right moment is when I got my posting for COVID duty in Ballari. So it was pretty crazy, to be honest, because nobody knew. It was new for everybody. Everybody was trying to figure things out. In fact, I remember the very first meeting that I sat through. They were talking about DCHC. They were talking about CCC. They were talking about HFNO. They were talking about. It was just random alphabets flying around.
yeah.
So they could have just as well been saying ABCD for all I know. So that was how clueless I was, honestly. But I think you need to go with the flow at times to to be of help wherever you can be. So we were manning some of the COVID care centers. We were trying to get the testing on track. And we were trying to see if the tracking of primary and secondary contacts are going on effectively. So that was mostly what we were part of during that time. And I think my biggest learning, I think that of that transient nature of everything was probably a result of that, because we could literally see around, how many people are dying, how many people are suffering. So people who were in extremely well paid positions, who managed to get a really good hospital bed, could not last an hour. And similarly, probably an old man from a small village was right next to the same rich person who was also dying. So at that point, you realize that, it's life at the end of the day. It's not a lot of these things that we've accumulated as important in our lives probably aren't going to be that important, be it our careers, be it our money, be it our sometimes maybe even our family. So I think that's what it taught me, that process.
I think it gives a lot of perspective.
Perspective, definitely, yes.
And I feel like all of us have gone through COVID and realized the fallacy of planning as a concept.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that contributed to it too.
Yeah, to a large extent, yes.
On that note, what is your life beyond a civil servant? I know that it's a very intensive job and very hectic job, I can only imagine. Um, how do you like to spend your time beyond your profession?
So I believe that people mostly make their profession, not necessarily this profession, but people generally make their profession their life. So if you take away the designation that they hold, what are they as an individual is something which is more important. So is there something that is going to make you happy waking up in the morning, even if you don't have this job, or even if you don't have this house that you're living in, even if you don't have probably even the family that you're living with? So what is it that you as an individual are driven by every day? That is something that's most important. So for me, this job is a part of my life, it's not the entire life. And that's very important because your job gives you a personality, not the other way around. As in, sorry. So it's the personality that you hold that will give you a job, not the other way around. So I think that's very important because for me, out of this job, I still take time out to teach children in NGOs through the NGO that I work with. There's an NGO in Chikballapur, Mudinhalli village, which is doing a lot of good work in the health sector and education sector. There's a Sarla Memorial Hospital, and there's a soon to be coming up free medical college that they're going to be starting. So with a lot of significant work that they're doing, it it gives me a lot of purpose to be part of a mission like that. There's another NGO that's called Youth for Seva that has been consistently doing a lot of good work quietly in the space of education, health, and environment. So I'm associated with all of these organizations, and it makes me happy to know that my purpose at the end of graduation, what I decided as I just want to do some good work, and that came to fruition through this job. And I know that even without this job, I am still able to do that, irrespective of everything else. So that's something that gives me a lot of calmness and peace, and it helps me to be hopeful for the day. So that's something that gives me great joy.
Oh, that's amazing. I've seen a lot of Youth for Seva murals around
I think
the city.
that's Youth for Parivartan, the red wall with the white painting.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think that's the same initiative. This is a different one.
Oh, all right. Either way, one question I really like asking everybody I meet is, what is one book that impacted your life?
So actually, there are two books that I
Okay.
want to quote. One is, of course, something that I have been exposed to right from childhood, but only came to realize its importance towards the recent couple of years. That's the Bhagavad Gita. So what stunned me is there's this guy, Arjuna, who's saying that I don't want to fight a war. I choose non-violence. I choose peace. And there is this his guru who is saying that no, fight a war. So what could possibly go on for the next 18 chapters that is going to counter somebody who's already saying that I want peace. I choose peace. So that's something that really got me curious. And in this role, in this work, the Gita has helped me in a lot of way to understand what it is that you work for, why you work, and how is it going to help, and what is the nature in which you have to work. That's one. The second book is called Hind's Feet on High Places. It's by the author is Hannah Hannard. She it's she's from a Orthodox Christian background, but she has written a beautiful book on what it means to lead a life in sync with the universe. So that's something.
Okay.
That's something that these two books I think are something that I never get bored of reading any number of times. So those two.
I think even I personally took a lot away from the Bhagavad Gita, specifically the story of Draupadi. Um, she was born into a life of misery, and she still made her life of service for her partners, for herself, for her society, for her kingdom. And I thought that was a very powerful story, and I really connected with that. So it was great hearing that from you as well. Um, I think that brings us to the rare end of this interview. Ma'am, it was an absolute pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much.
I personally learned so much from our conversation today that I know I will take forward into my life, and I hope our viewers did too.
Yes.
Um, we would be honored to have you back soon.
Oh.
Um,
Okay.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was lovely being interviewed by you. Thank you.